Hi, I'm Senator Mike Lee. Welcome to the Constitution Line by Line. Today we're going to be talking about Article 1, Section 5. So let's start with the words themselves. Article 1, Section 5 provides that, quote, each House shall be the judge of the elections, returns, and qualifications of its own members, and a majority of each shall constitute a quorum to do business. But a smaller number may adjourn from day to day and may be authorized to compel the attendance of absent members in such manner and under such penalties as each House may provide. Each House may determine the rules of its proceedings, punish its members for disorderly behavior, and with the concurrence of 2/3, expel a member. Each House shall keep a journal of its proceedings, and from time to time publish the same, excepting such parts as may in their judgment require secrecy, and the yeas and nays of the members of either House on any question shall, at the desire of 1/5 of those present, be entered on the journal. Neither House during the session of Congress shall, without the consent of the other, adjourn for more than 3 days, nor to any other place than that in which the two Houses shall be sitting. Let's talk about what this section means. Well, Article 1, Section 5 outlines some of the powers and the duties of Congress with respect to the operation of each House of Congress. And it outlines the process by which the rules can be adopted within each chamber, and the process by which records are kept, and the circumstances under which members can be expelled, and each House can adjourn. Allowing each House to set its own rules gave Congress the flexibility, and it allowed each House to have independence from the executive branch and from the other House of Congress, while requirements for record keeping offered transparency for voters. The final clause in Article 1, Section 5 was intended to prevent either House of Congress from undermining the other by going on vacation or otherwise adjourning for extended periods of time to avoid having to vote on legislation. There are a couple of issues addressed in Article 1, Section 5 that continue to have very significant relevance today. First, the ability of each House of Congress to decide contested elections remains important, especially in an era of increased partisanship, where there are a lot of concerns over both voter fraud and voter suppression. It's also important to remember that while Congress has made the ultimate judge over elections for U.S. House races and U.S. Senate races, there's no corresponding authority for Congress to be the arbiter of the outcome of other elections, including elections for state or local officers, or even for President of the United States. Congress's role in that area, outlined in the 12th Amendment, is much narrower. Ultimately, the arbiters of who won a presidential election, and for that matter, even whether to hold a presidential election, that's up to each state legislature. We'll cover that in a different episode. Second, the ability of each House to determine its own rules has been very much in the news with respect to what's known as the filibuster, which is encompassed within Senate Rule 22. Under Senate Rule 22, remember, it takes a simple majority to pass either legislation or a nominee through the Senate. A simple majority. But typically, in order to get to a point where you can pass a nominee or you can pass legislation, you first have to bring debate to a close with respect to that nominee or with respect to that legislation. And bringing debate to a close under Rule 22 of the Senate rules takes 60 votes. It takes a 3/5 supermajority. Some of that's been narrowed as a result of intervention by members of the Senate themselves. In 2013, the Democratic majority under the leadership of Harry Reid ended up nuking the filibuster with respect to presidential nominees. And this was a move that had lasting impacts, but we still have cloture votes, but cloture votes are now decided with a simple majority vote. This was an end run around the Senate rules, which are supposed to require a 2/3 supermajority vote anytime you change the rules of the Senate. When you nuke the filibuster, you're essentially saying that with 51 votes, we can undo what the Senate rules say by reinterpreting them. The filibuster still comes up. It is still a very significant issue. Rule 22, while still followed in form, lacks a whole lot of substance in the area of presidential nominations. When those are confirmed, cloture is decided on a simple majority basis. But we still follow the text of Rule 22 when it comes to legislation. This still takes a 3/5 supermajority to bring debate to a close on legislation. Finally, the record-keeping requirements of Article 1, Section 5 are important, as it's become common practice for leadership in both houses of Congress and in both political parties to hold voice votes in order to prevent members from having to actually go on the record and cast a recorded vote. Now, there are a small handful of legislators, most notably Thomas Massey from Kentucky in the House of Representatives, who have been calling for recorded votes for reasons of transparency and accountability. It's important always for members of Congress, regardless of their political party and regardless of which House of Congress in which they're serving. Each House has the ability and the authority to prescribe rules governing the behavior of members. And if you violate those rules, or if you're otherwise found to be engaging in misconduct, 2/3 of the members of the House of Congress in which you serve can choose to expel you. The final clause of Article 1, Section 5, specifying the conditions for recess, has most recently been invoked by leadership to keep Congress in session in order to prevent the President of the United States from making recess appointments. This is a practice that's been recognized and been upheld by the Supreme Court as recently as NLRB versus Noel Canning, which was a case decided by the Supreme Court in 2014. Article 1, Section 5, and the rules that have been adopted by both houses of Congress from time to time get challenged in court. For example, some people have argued that Rule 22 of the Senate rules, the rule requiring cloture votes, a supermajority cloture vote, some have argued that that's somehow unconstitutional because the Constitution requires only a simple majority vote for passage. That argument has been rejected in a 2014 case decided by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit in a case called Common Cause versus Biden. The D.C. Circuit held that Article 1, Section 5 grants the Senate the authority to set its own rules, including those governing the filibuster. Rule 22 of the Senate rules is going to continue to be important, especially as you've got increased calls by people within the Democratic Party who want to be able to pass legislation without having to go through the burdensome step of bringing debate to a close with 60 votes, or 3/5 of the Senate voting to do that. So anytime they can get a simple majority of the senators, if they can get 51 senators to agree to change the precedent, to treat the 60 vote requirement for bringing debate to a close under Rule 22 as if it were 51. In other words, to make 51 the new 60 in violation of the Senate rules. If they can do that, then it'll make it a lot easier to pass legislation because they won't have to follow the intentionally burdensome requirements of Rule 22. But the outcome will be less bipartisanship. The outcome will be less rigorous debate and discussion, less of an opportunity for senators representing a minority viewpoint within the Senate to have their voices heard. So today we've discussed Article 1, Section 5, and we've discussed the fact that Article 1, Section 5 establishes rulemaking power to each House of Congress, and each House of Congress is in charge of its own procedures. This is an important part of understanding the Constitution because the Constitution outlines the rights of the people, and one of the ways in which it does that is by setting up a structure and deciding who gets to decide what and how they decide it. Article 1, Section 5 It represents a culmination of the allocation of the procedural rulemaking within the Congress itself. Thank you for joining me for the Constitution Line by Line.